Hello and welcome back to Decision Makers. Remember, it's the podcast putting you in the boardroom where decisions are made, breaking down any of the secrets of the trade. So far, so good, I think. I'm Hugh Woozencroft. Alongside me, Marlon Fleischmann, the managing director of Unique Sports Group, is here. Apologies, because Curtis Davis isn't with us at the moment, but he'll be back for the next episode, don't worry. And I'm delighted to say we're joined by the independent journalist Miguel Delaney and author of the new book, States of Play, How Sportswashing Took Over Football. Miguel, how are you?
Not too bad, thanks. Not too bad.
Today's episode, everyone, I think is an interesting one. It's not going to be too detailed because I think some people are afraid of these two terms that we sometimes use. They're the famous acronyms now across the game, FFP and PSR. What are they all about? And I guess that's where we should probably start. Miguel, I'll start with you on this one, and we'll start with FFP because they are different. I think for a lot of people, they think, well, they're the same thing, just two different phrases, but they've come from, if you like, two different organisations and governing bodies.
Yeah, I mean, FFP, originally UEFA, that the Premier League, I suppose, because their clubs had to play in European competition, the Premier League had no choice but to adapt because there had to be consistency. And the Premier League's rules eventually evolved into PSR, Profit and Sustainability. Funnily, UEFA have actually changed the name of their own rules as well, so they're no longer financial fair play. But yeah, as you say, it does only come down to FFP, PSR. And I think maybe a good place to start with this, because this, I think, maybe both sets a maybe framework for the discussion and also maybe gives a little bit of explanations of what this all is, which is basically why it's worth imagining what the football world would look like without these rules, because this is ultimately why they were brought in. We have an example. Basically, in the early 2000s, there was a situation where obviously a lot more money was coming into the game through the expansion of the Champions League, change of broadcasting. It suddenly exploded at the turn of the millennium. That led to a kind of a wage boom and a transfer boom. But the issue was, in trying to keep up, tons of clubs across Europe were overextending themselves. And I suppose probably the two most famous examples are actually the semi-finalists from the Champions League in 2001, who directly played each other, Valencia and Leeds United. Within 3 years, because they'd spent so much and essentially couldn't meet it, Leeds were relegated, having to sell all of their best players. And Valencia, basically since that period, since 2004, have had a series of financial issues. So the basis of the rules at that point was initially to bring in some sort of system that linked what a team could spend to what they were brought in. Now, I know, well, I'm sure we'll get onto this, people talk about owners being able to invest what they want and how it prohibits. But particularly at that point in European football history, they found you couldn't depend on owner funding, that tons of clubs are going bust. So that is the core of the rule, basically, to stop clubs overextending themselves and ensure financial sustainability. Now, and from that perspective, I would say the rules have been a success because the sheer number of clubs, and I know people will point to Bury and the likes of that, and obviously financial issues in football remain, but in those base terms alone, clubs going bust across Europe, the rules have succeeded. But obviously, there's a lot more to this that I'm sure we'll get into.
I want to get into it straight away. I think that element of PSR being different to FFP, have the Premier League been kinder to themselves than UEFA have been to their clubs? Like, what is the real difference?
So what the Premier League would do is they basically allow more losses. I think the difference is now, I think it's 135 to 135 million. So like the UEFA will only UEFA only allow losses over 3 seasons. It's a very small number, 35 million. That could be covered by the owner. Whereas the Premier League, taking the view, I suppose, that their competition is more dynamic, allows for more mobility, allows for more, not necessarily risk-taking, but more investment. The figure there are higher and goes over 100 million, which I suppose just allows a bit more leeway to spend, while also the Premier League would say ensuring financial sustainability. And that's what FFP became in the Premier League. It went from that financial fair play, as it was called, into profit and sustainability rules.
Marlon, sounds like a good thing.
I think it goes back to management of football clubs, what sort of club you want to run, and what sort of time pressures you have. I think the two examples that Miguel mentioned earlier, Leeds and Valencia, they were slapdash, win at all costs, and we're going to go for it. It was bravery, but it was bravery where, was it tight on the balance sheets? Did they go, right, we're football strategy, are we financial strategy as well? They probably didn't. And it was win at all costs because the prizes for winning were so great.
Unbelievable, really, when you think back to those periods. You know, some classic football matches, some incredible football teams, but the after effects for the supporters of those clubs, you can understand why those changes were brought in. The meaningful impact on clubs today, Miguel, though, have we moved out of that period? Are these rules now holding clubs back for you?
Can we say we've moved out of that period, though? Because if you look at, say, the EFL, and this is where we get into this, so many clubs are operating their wage bills are very close to 100% of their income. So if there weren't any kind of restrictions at all, what would be happening to clubs? And I think this is where you I think we can probably trick ourselves a little bit. Not trick ourselves, but more so, we almost taken the effects of the rules for granted, more so, I would say. But ultimately, the rules have a concrete effect, whereas if they were to be removed, I think football could see a range of problems, because it's almost that tension within football, isn't it? I suppose that because it is ultimately competition, it's sporting competition, which means, and you can see this with the way players play, there's always that will to push themselves, and that extends almost into the boardroom, where if there's a deal to be done that can improve a player, clubs will often take that in, and obviously attempting to do it within an overall financial framework, but they will attempt to get it done, to kind of push themselves that bit more. And if there are no checks there, even if clubs try to act responsibly, that impetus in football creates issues. So I think it's why some sort of financial regulation is essential. I suppose let's look at the other side of this as well. I suppose if we were to imagine it was to go back to, say, the early 2000s, and it was a world that it was then with no real financial regulation all in place, but I suppose what would happen in the modern era, and remember that this was pre-Abramovich as well. I mean, ultimately, I suppose we have to be kind of open about it. City and Newcastle have the wealthiest owners. They would probably spend as much as they wanted, really, and this is if there was no regulation. We'd probably be talking about huge wages for players. Everyone else would push themselves to try and keep up, because I think that is why there is this need for some sort of check and regulations to stop clubs, I suppose, spending as much as they will until basically they can't. And let's not forget as well, it's not just about kind of, I suppose, obviously Leeds and Valencia were the most prominent examples, but what UEFA would have found in the early 2000s was that, and this, I mean, Marlon will I'm sure, have a lot of knowledge of just what the landscape was like as well. But UEFA's feeling was that a lot of clubs were agreeing transfers. They'd know they could pay the first installment, but had no idea how they could pay the second. And a lot of this was they'd hope, say, that there'd be some kind of commercial uplift from the signings, so then they get more income and they could play the second. But often that didn't happen. It created a bit of a wild west in European football. At levels below the top leagues, and even at some clubs in the top leagues, players were going unpaid. And I think that's why, just as a core, you do need some form of financial regulation in place. I suppose then it comes down to, well, you know, what that looks like. But I think for multiple reasons, the rules actually by definition almost have to be complex, because you have to kind of consider things like competitive balance, the different levels of teams and who can send and what their income is, and allow for some sort of mobility as well, which I think is a key to this. And again, I'm sure we'll get onto, given that's been one of the main discussions in the Premier League about whether PSO and FFP have frozen clubs in place, and that's an argument I do have sympathy with. But I think there are other ways to tackle it. But yeah, I think that's the thing. I wouldn't say that it's that we've moved past it. I'd say it's that the effects have had such concrete impact.
I think, just jumping in there on a couple of things Miguel said, for me, of course you need, I'm not going to advocate for a world where there wasn't any regulations or financial control, because that put the future of clubs, the futures of players' contracts at risk, and no fan or anyone involved in football wants to see that happen. But you're trying to put a wraparound regulation on finance around one of the most complex industries where it is just competitive. How do you restrict competitiveness in a way that's fair to everyone? And when you've got such different ownerships and such level of wealth amongst the ownership groups, it's impossible to find a one cap fits all approach. You can't. And that's where you have all these individual arguments between clubs, between regulators. You can't narrow it down to one set of rules and apply it to everyone.
You've brought in something interesting there, and that's the element of competitiveness. I also want to ask you about what Miguel said there. I think he alluded to responsible behaviour of football clubs. So let's start with the competitiveness argument when it comes to PSR and FFP. Clubs frozen in place, I think, is what Miguel said. Do you understand where fans are coming from when they make that argument? And do you think it is important that there's more competitiveness? I don't know what you think the actual level of competitiveness is. I'm assuming, but do we need more competitiveness? And do you think PSR is holding clubs back from being more competitive?
Let me think about that one. Hang on.
And all right, we can start with the behaviour of football clubs as well. You got time to mull it over in the back of your mind.
I think going back to the question of clubs being frozen, I think the Premier League, if we look domestically, we're only starting to see the behaviour or the changes in behaviour of football clubs now. If you were to look into Spain and Italy, that certainly felt the original FFP rules hit harder. The transfer markets in Spain especially, they are frozen. There hardly is a transfer market in Spain. They get dictated to every year by the governing body in Spain what they can and what they can't spend. Clubs going into a transfer window don't know what they can spend until they're told, based on their financial results. That paralyses the transfer market. And if you're talking about competitive nature, I think that the Spanish league in particular has suffered huge damage because of this.
The one thing I would say about that, Marlon, is like I'm half Spanish, and one of my clubs is Osasuna, where I'm up this from in the Navarra area. Well, so one of the things they would say in Spain, I suppose, is that maybe what's happening right now is almost just a necessary check because of, I suppose, what we're talking about, which was years of over expenditure. And also Spain's in a little bit of a funny situation because up until 2014, basically, there were regulations essentially, it's a bit further back than 2014, but that's when the effects started to change. It was a situation where Barcelona and Madrid hoovered up 90% of all TV money, which created a totally uneven market. And then so many clubs overextended themselves to try and keep up. So it led to this almost decade of, I suppose, what we're talking about before, clubs pushing themselves to the limit. So I think La Liga's argument would be that these checks are necessary now. It's short-term pain, basically, for long-term gain to encourage clubs to behave responsibly. And after that, then you will see a return to, I suppose, clubs being able to spend and maybe a more kind of...
Do you think the La Liga product now, and the current state of the league versus how it was previously, is stronger or weaker now? It's weaker, right?
But I think there's a few factors there. I think that but La Liga was strong basically because Barcelona and Madrid were both so good, but also because they could spend so much more than everyone else. And I suppose that led to kind of a peak of what these clubs were in terms of kind of being able to attract the best talent in the world. But that's good for Barcelona and Real Madrid. It wasn't good for the rest of La Liga. And the two clubs basically cannibalized everyone else. And I think it's specifically because of that period, as brilliant as the Clasico matches were. But let's not forget, at that point, while Barca or Madrid were winning every Liga, the Premier League, up until Manchester City, actually had 9 years there where no one retained the title. What the winners were United, City, United, Chelsea, Leicester, we'll go back around to Liverpool again. Arsenal won it just in last 2004, but there was a variety and kind of vitality to the winners, and I think it was that, and that kind of that the Premier League had more competitive balance. There was more of a sense that anyone could beat anyone. That saw the Premier League overtake La Liga, despite La Liga having the two best teams in the world. And I suppose this is where we're getting into kind of what you were talking about earlier as well, just in terms of kind of having to have, you can't have one cap fits all. There has to be some sort of nuance to the regulation.
Do you think it's gone too far? Do you think if we're on the Spanish market, and it's good that you have that knowledge, do you think it's gone too far? Because we have to look at the effects of what's happened to the clubs and go, is that going to happen to the Premier League clubs? Are they going to lose their ability to move in the transfer market, to be ultimately as competitive as they can do? Do you think that has been overly restrictive?
My view, I suppose, would be it's about football has to take kind of medium to long-term approaches, in that if they just allow situations to continue unchecked, that's where you get into situations that could even though it causes freezing now, or issues now, that allowing that to continue would cause further problems down the line.
It's football austerity, right? That's what we are. If we look in politics and the landscape, it's football austerity, right?
Well,
that's what it feels. No, that's what it is.
We talk about austerity though, but we're still in a situation where the Premier League, its wage bill is 2 billion more than any other league in Europe.
Yeah, but then the broadcast deals are X amount more than any other league in Europe. So it's all relative. It's all relative to the money coming into the league. I think where I picked up on what you said before. It's short, medium-term pain for long-term growth in the Spanish market. That's austerity.
Yeah, but there is also. Go ahead, Miguel.
I would say it's in this case, because we have an era of such success in European football. It's just about promoting sustainability rather than necessarily austerity. And I suppose just a kind of a rearrangement of club finances.
You know, the players get paid what they will based on what the club earns, basically. You look at Atalanta in Italy and Serie A, obviously, and the pain that they had in Italy. They were, of course, the greatest league in European football for a considerable period, but they've got basically the wage bill of a top championship club. You know, one that hasn't been in the Premier League. You know, they are able to do something. I get it. They're not going to win the Champions League, but they're able to put a product together which is very competitive, despite the fact that they aren't spending huge numbers. Maybe they're an anomaly at this point in time, but my point is, if there was less money in the Premier League, there could still be very good teams. The players would just earn less. The transfer fees would just be smaller.
The transfer strategies are completely different. And you look at, you speak about Atalanta, we could talk about Brentford. Mm-hmm. Okay, Brentford don't spend the same, or Brighton are starting to creep up in their spend. But the image on the profile of the type of player they sign are well within their financial limits. Where I think what we spoke about earlier, clubs getting into trouble, is where they want to sign that superstar who is ready-made, who is here and now, and you're buying them at a premium price. What you mentioned with Atalanta is they're growing assets. They're buying at a certain point, be it transfer fee, salary they're playing, to then go, right, in 3 years' time, we're trading that player. We're trading. They're trading clubs. They're not, we want to sign instant success right now. We've got a number 9 spot and we're going to go and buy the best in the world.
But it's still, and even the clubs that you mentioned, you know, it still kind of goes against the argument that the league could be less competitive. You know, I get it. I understand what's happened in Spain if there were financial constraints. My point is, everyone doesn't have to have a large pot of money for the league to be competitive. You know, there are teams who are spending less who are very competitive. I think the money has kind of overtaken the element of what happens on the training pitch. You know, like you say, that strategy of, well, do we go and get the young players, the assets to grow? You know, there are a lot of clubs, and I think it's because they've got the money in their pocket who are like, we don't really need to do that. It's the clubs who don't have money who need to do that. You know, the Premier League TV money gives us enough that we can go out and get a great player who's doing well in Spain, or even, you know, further afield, I don't know, Georgia, you know, wherever it might be, Poland. You know, we can cherry pick the best players across the continent, even go down to Brazil or Argentina and find a great young player who's going to be the future. And spend £30 million on an unproven one because, you know, well, someone will buy them for 20 million off us if we train them up for a couple of years, even if they're not a success.
You can apply that model to a Brentford. You can apply that model to any, what you class as a challenger club, okay? You can't apply that model to one of the top Champions League clubs because the demands of success say you need to sign the best players for your club to keep that success. Because once you're used to attaining the finances that come with success, you need to keep that train running. And that means, is it acceptable to fans if suddenly we go, actually, we're only going to sign players under the age of 24 that in 3 years' time we could sell? Do you think United, Arsenal fans, Chelsea fans accept that?
If you win. I think fans will always accept
and how
the
many,
strategy
exactly,
if you win.
But how many leagues have Brentford won?
Yeah.
This is the argument. I love Brentford. I love exactly what they're doing. Are they going to win the Premier League off the back of it? They're going to need to creep up and start spending more.
Yeah, it's interesting. I get it. There are different levels. But if you look at Liverpool, for example, the level that they were at in terms of their spending, they didn't go out and spend Manchester United money or Manchester City money. They obviously spent a considerable amount of money, but they could get a Salah in for 30 million, a Sadio Mane in for similar money, Roberto Firmino for 25 odd million. I get it. They won the Premier League maybe because of the incredible manager that they had and the money that they paid him, which obviously a lot of clubs can't afford. But they did it in a slightly different way and they managed to get there. Now, that might be a once in a decade story. That might be the only difference.
I think you've touched on Liverpool, and it pains me to say it because I'm actually a Spurs fan, but Arsenal, okay? Those are two clubs that if you're going to say or look at clubs that you believe are doing it the right way, those clubs are. They're not wasteful in the transfer fee. They don't overpay, but they buy quality, and they buy quality that they know will have a decent sell-on value, even if it doesn't work out for that player at that club.
On that, Marlon, I suppose this is a bit of a tangent to what we're talking about, but I think it's probably a response to PSR across Europe, actually. Have you noticed this, actually? Because just from trying to survey the market of the past 2 years, it feels like, say, what clubs like Dortmund and Sevilla used to do, where they buy kind of young to sell on high. That model has almost been appropriated by the biggest clubs. So, like, obviously Real Madrid, they did it a lot, well, essentially up until this season, and they bought Mbappe, or they got him on a Bosman. But they obviously, Vinicius, I think it's something like 6 of their Champions League lineup, they signed before the age of 20. Obviously, Arsenal kind of went to that model as well. Manchester United are now going to do it under Ineos, or at least that's what they say they're attempting to with the Euro deal. But obviously, I suppose the rationale here isn't necessarily to sell on. It's almost more to get around other elements of the market and how younger players be on lower wages. Like, is that something you think has happened, or I suppose what's your view on that, and if so, the causes on it?
I think it's going to be realignment of transfer fees. I think clubs are being, if I can bring a player in now, like we said before, 25, 30 million, and have that player for 4 years, 5 years, that saves me having to buy a player in that position twice or 3 times in the same period. To buy like we said before, the ready-made superstar, the 28-year-old, that costs a lot. But if you have that ready-made superstar and you're building 2-3 years earlier, the costs are so much lower, which is why everyone's trying to hit that sweet spot and say, right, we don't want to overpay. So if we believe he's the right one, we'd rather get him in earlier. And maybe he doesn't go in the team straight away. Maybe he's the understudy for the year. And then we can sell one and he comes in. So it's all succession planning as well.
The second point I wanted to raise, Miguel alluded to earlier, was that point of clubs behaving badly. We've seen clubs have points deducted over breaking these rules in the Premier League. Everton deducted 10 points, later reduced to 6. I think they breached by £19.5 million. Nottingham Forest, 4 points deducted. Their breach was almost 35 million, albeit a lower cap due to them starting the accounting period inside the EFL. We know 115 charges hang over Manchester City. They, of course, are going through that time, if you like, with the independent investigation judgment to come next year. Leicester did overspend the cap, managed to get around it on a legal technicality as well. I don't think they'd argue they didn't overspend, but the rules weren't watertight, so they're probably the most successful club around this. And it's also been reported recently that 8 Premier League clubs are at risk of breaking PSR in 24-25. So are the clubs behaving badly? Do they know that this is coming and yet they still spend at the same level?
I think there's a fear that if you look at Leicester or Nottingham Forest or Everton, the fear of relegation is, if that's looming over you, you will spend to get yourself out of that and then try and kick that can down the road. And that is what clubs have tried to do. The downward of getting relegation, that's no reality that a club wants to face. So they will spend And if we look at, I think Wolves are another one. When they were at the foot of the table 2 years ago, I think they spent heavily in January. Heavily. They didn't at that point go, you know what, we've got 2 years, 3 years to wait for that 23-year-old to come good. They went and they signed ready-made players at an expense, which pulled them away. Was that in their financial planning? No, it wasn't. There's no way at the start of the season they had in their books they were going to do that much amount of spend in a January window. They had to, because they couldn't afford to get relegated.
Yeah, I used to get a lot of criticism for calling Mike Ashley a good owner when he was at Newcastle United, Miguel, because actually with their accounts, they'd kind of always break even, maybe make a couple of £1 million profit. And when you looked across the Premier League, they were one of 1, 2, maybe 3 clubs who were actually, at that point in the black. So you'd always go, well, he spends when you get relegated to get you back into the Premier League, but he doesn't, bet the house on staying in the Premier League. Obviously, Newcastle fans had a big problem with Mike Ashley. It's so interesting to know what they think should be done with their spending now they've got new owners. But for me, his behaviour was appropriate. He didn't put the club in the financial position that they might have been going bust. Was he wrong to do it?
Well, I suppose, I'd say I disagree on Ashley being a good owner, because it was almost kind of, I think with the way that club was run, it went beyond keeping them kind of sustainable. It was almost like there were times when you thought it was just Newcastle existing to be in the Premier League rather than necessarily, seeking to thrive or seeking to grow in any way that could excite fans. And I think there's bigger discussions to be had about Newcastle. But I think they do touch on something interesting here, which I suppose is and this is one reason I point to say why regulators maybe have to take long-term views and the issue of unintended consequences. So like if you and again, I think it's why regulators would say it's helpful to imagine a world where these rules aren't in place. To my mind, again, I think what would happen is, again, the current owners, City, Newcastle, they'll spend as much as they want to create the best squads in the planet. We're probably talking huge wages. There's no checks. I think every other club, if there's no checks, will spend as much as possible to keep up. And then it comes down to a battle of, well, who's got the most wealthy owner and which owner wants to keep it sustainable. And there are huge inequalities there. Huge differences, which almost football as a sport can't necessarily handle. I think that would make football less competitive rather than more. And because, yes, owners will be able to put in as much money as they want, but it won't necessarily be enough. And I think we actually have a very, the interesting thing there is we have a key example of this, which is basically the Premier League around 2005. So 2005 or around that period is key, because what happens 2 years beforehand, Abramovich is allowed by Chelsea. No one has ever seen anyone of that wealth ever in football. It's it's less than 10 years after Jack Walker wins the title of Blackburn with a fortune of 300 million. Abramovich is a magnitude beyond that. And one of the key examples, suddenly he doesn't have to think about transfer installments. He can just pay up front. The money's in your account within half an hour. It changes everything. But what it did was it suddenly moved the idea of ownership into a sphere. And if you look at into a new sphere, if you look at the 5 years after Abramovich, that's a period where basically a series of initially English owners, or you call them local owners in the Premier League, say, they all felt they had to sell up because they couldn't keep up with this new sphere of owner. And like Sir John Hall, the former Newcastle owner, he's on record about this, saying, Abramovich turned into this era of business of football. We just can't keep spending the money. And now I suppose one of the ironies of that is it was those series of sales, and it was like Liverpool were sold. Obviously, Ken Wright tried to keep influence at Everton, but again, it came down to they couldn't match bigger spenders in the same way. And there's an irony, of course, because Everton, one of the founders of the Premier League, are one of the 5 that most pushed for it. But that half decade, which saw a lot of English owners sell up. Well, one of the main nationality of buyers were the American owners, who a lot of them have a similar capitalist outlook, but also they own American franchises, and they've been among the biggest proponents for financial regulation, essentially FFP, PSR. So it's just I think all of that is probably why regulators have to take longer term views on this, and I suppose consider unintended consequences as well.
Well, that's how things stand, Miguel. Appreciate that. I do want to find out what the effect has been, particularly when it comes to player deals on agents, intermediaries and agencies. How has PSR and FFP affected the market for players? Do we see at this point either a higher frequency of deals, a backing off of clubs spending money, or no real change?
No, there's been a change. I think it's very evident in the last probably 2 windows, especially coming off the summer window we've just had. Spending was down overall. But I think what we're going to begin to see more of, and it's more of a concern when we look at it from the players' perspectives, of this spotlight being shone on talent that is 25 and under. You know, it used to be that you were in your peak at 27, 28, and even at 30 you were getting good contracts. I think the focus on always having an asset value attached to you and being able to trade out of a player to help headroom in the PSR means that the players that are over 28, they've had the most dramatic effect on this. The most dramatic effect. You try getting a longer term contract, you try negotiating a pay rise, you try negotiating some form of protections on a player that you know is heading towards what you class as twilight years. They're being told, and it doesn't matter what sort of club servant they've been, they're in the land now of 1 year deals. 1 year plus maybe an option on how many games you play in a season. And you're not going to get a pay rise. We're going to give you a performance bonus just in case you start to not be as productive on the pitch. So the amount you can earn as a player, especially in those twilight years, is having a massive downturn based on this PSR. And I think it will end up cutting down the average age of a player's career, because there won't be those clubs that are willing to sign a player who's coming off of a 5-year deal at, say, 30, 31. There isn't going to be that appetite for clubs to take those players on.
Has it affected wages as well, the actual individual offers? You know, instead of just the deals, when you sit down at the table to negotiate, a club saying, listen, this is all we've got because of PSR.
No, I think we're a little bit wiser as to what their headroom's going to be. And we know the clubs, what they generally have as their wage or salary guidelines and what they can pay. But you can't get away from the word competitiveness and competition. If 3 clubs are going for the same player, the salary is going to be competitive, because you're not just going to go and take the same salary across 3 clubs. The clubs will bid against each other on that one. And it's our job and the players' jobs to go and negotiate the best they can. The younger players are understanding now, hang on, we're the ones they all want. I don't want this contract that a 22-year-old player would get 5 years ago versus the value of a 22-year-old now is completely different. The 22-year-old now, who is this big superstar, is going to demand to be treated as the 26, 27-year-old was 5 years ago. That's the change in it. This we used to hero a 26, 27-year-old as being he's in his prime. No, the sweet spot now is 22 to 23, 24-year-olds. That's your sweet spot. And that's where you're going to maximise your earnings. What PSR has done has made younger players understand their importance and the role of this. And actually, that's when you move. And it's also made players understand that if I'm 27, 28, I'm going to extend for as long as I possibly can do, because I'm seeing what's happening to the previous generation that are coming out of contracts now that cannot find employment.
PSR has also done something. I can ask you both about it, but I'll start with you, Marlon, when it comes to homegrown players. Particularly last summer, a number of big clubs almost, I guess they weren't doing it themselves, but when you listen to the media around certain deals, the strong implication is we need to sell players that have come out of the academy because of the technicalities of PSR. That being a homegrown player goes down on the balance sheet as pure profit, we hear, rather than a player who we bought into the club being sold. I guess you can try and maybe explain how that works for people, but also whether that rule is really bad for the game, really bad for the players that you work with.
I think there's positives and negatives to this one. And I think the positive from our side is that it stops clubs from just sitting on their young players and just having them. The word I used to hate was, we like having him around. He's good around the place. He's good for training. You don't want that for your client. You want your client to be playing and being valued. So what it does do is it stops clubs going, oh, we'll just keep 3 young players around, because suddenly, actually, it forces a conversation. Do we really need them? Are they going to play for me? Or do we cash in? If a player's not playing, you're happy for them to be cashed in so that they can go find a new club and actually push on with their career. But it has to be on terms that works for them. And that's the next negative that we're going to come on to is, and we've seen it this window, almost players being forced out of clubs because suddenly they're not a player, they're a number. And that's the dangerous area where players should move if they want to move, and providing it makes sense to them. They shouldn't be felt, and we saw almost a return to the infamous bomb squads where you are treated and acted and you report at different times and you train away and you are made absolutely clear you are not valued at this club. That can't happen. For me, you've got to treat your players with respect across the board. They're teammates. You can't suddenly separate the changing room just based on the financial decision that you need to cash in on him. I think clubs need to work with the players and with the agents and say, look, we have to find a solution.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. I think certain clubs, won't mention them, but the treatment of players that you want to leave the club has become very, very strange. Like, you can sit down with an agent and say, we really need you to move on for financial reasons. But some of the treatment around giving away numbers and putting people into different changing rooms and people with 70, 80 international caps being made to train with the kids just because you want to move them on. I like to think that English football has a little bit of an element of respect for their players, but it seems like, cash is king. And the financial pressures there, and maybe they're brought on by PSR, Miguel, is maybe making clubs, act in a way that even they wouldn't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I that is one of my biggest issues, I have to say, with PSR. The unintended consequence, again, of what it's done to homegrown players. I suppose, it could be argued that's not so much an issue of PSR. It's about kind of football or the Premier League, or UEFA, FIFA's rules on this. I mean, ultimately, if you're basing this on accounting principles, you can't get around the idea of, principles like immortalization and why it is that if you sell an academy graduate rather than a player you've bought, that's pure profit. Well, does that come, if it is going to be in this PSR system, does the Premier League have to come up with more creative ways so there aren't incentives to sell players in that way? Because, really, that's what supporting a club is supposed to be all about. And to my mind, it's something that's always to the benefit of clubs. When you bring through someone who's been at the academy, who's gone through the club, you feel a better identity of the club. It deepens the identity of the club and creates more of a link. But yeah, I would agree it's one of a few flaws that you can point to in the consequences of PSR in this way. And yeah, I think to take your question or do it more directly, this is something that's really come up in football over the last years, where it's not clubs trying to evade the rules. It's essentially looking for loopholes in the rules, or basically scrutinizing the rules in depth to see what they can do so they don't breach PSR. And, people will point to examples like the Chelsea hotels or whatever, or the way you sell young players. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it has altered the behaviour of clubs.
Fans will also point to, and another thing when it comes to spending, Marlon, I've got to put you on the spot with this one. We will talk about the role of an agent later on in the series, but agents' fees. Now, if clubs are saying that they're held back by PSR, fans will say, well, agent fees make up a lot of spending. 23-24 season, £409.5 million spent by Premier League clubs on agents' fees. Is that where we see a depreciation possibly?
I think if you're looking at a football club's finances and their books, agents' fees don't even touch the side. They are a tiny proportion or percentage in comparison to salaries and transfer fees spent. So I think, it's always, and the media love to point to agents' fees as the big bad evil. It's a tiny percentage. If you add it all up, it's a tiny percentage of the overall spend on a football club. per football club, it's a tiny percentage of their overall spend. So changing that doesn't change the big picture. The big picture is overspending on transfer fees. And that's why clubs are being smarter in their transfer recruitment, not willing to overspend, and saying, you know what, instead of blowing all the money on this one, we're happy to look at 3 or 4 players, and whichever player fits our wage structure and fits our transfer fee, that's the one we're signing. I think that's where clubs are getting the best wins in terms of being run within their best financial means. Agency fees, it's a tiny percentage.
Okay, well then let's talk about the future of football finance, because I think we've pointed out that there are issues. There certainly are issues in many different areas. You know, we can talk about the players themselves, how it's affected you, the fans obviously feeling like their clubs are being held back as well. The owners, many of them very unhappy. Clearly, we're seeing that played out in several different courtrooms when it comes to the Premier League, UEFA as well. So let's try and take a look at a solutions-based future here. What could be the route through the sticky situation that we're currently looking at? Do we tighten our belts? Possibly not. You mentioned it, Marlon. We need to be a little bit shrewder. But we also feel like we're moving towards a period where the money in football is threatening the existence of competitions almost. You know, we've been threatened with a European Super League already. European football formats under UEFA have already been changed. More games we're seeing now, more teams involved in those competitions. New competitions like a Club World Cup as well. So when we talk about the solutions, there is the possibility that football just gets richer at this point in time. More TV deals, you know, more matches, more shirts to buy, more fans to come to competitions. Is that a solution, do you think?
Whether it's a solution, I think it's a reality. I think every club will be looking at their model now and going, right, how can we squeeze and eke out the absolute maximum from every part of the running of that football club? And broadcast is 1, ticket revenue is 2, you've got merchandising, you've got commercial and sponsorship, you've got a myriad of areas within the business where they're going to focus on and go, right, how can we maximise returns on this? Player trading is going to be right up there. Selling used to be a bit of a dirty word. Clubs didn't used to like selling their best players. Now, nothing's off the table. So it's okay if we go back to the transfer planning. If you're bringing the 23-year-old in, you're happy to now sell your 27-year-old. Selling is now part of it. So every club is going to be looking at their model and really trying to focus down on maximising each area of that. Playing games abroad, you've suddenly got what were just general pre-season games now wrapped up in a tournament. You've got teams leaving at the end of the current season, before they break up for summer holidays, whatever you want to call it. They'll do a pre-season game then, or a post-season game, and then they'll do a pre-season game. So they're looking at everywhere. But the problem we run into is through the want to generate new incomes and the want to create as much headroom as you can, you are running into walls. You're running into problems, and you're creating new problems by trying to fix. The first problem is, how do I create more headroom? You're now creating knock-on problems all over the place.
Miguel, clubs can also create that headroom Marlon spoke about there through, we've seen it a little bit, sponsorship, almost self-sponsorship, associated party transactions. But essentially, the likes of Manchester City and Newcastle believe that they should be able to spend more freely, that profit and sustainability rules hold them back from spending the money that they've got or from giving more sponsorship to the football club through associated businesses. Do you think that a change in PRSR rules can allow for more to be spent, and that actually would be a positive for the game, given everything that we've spoken about regarding other leagues?
Personally, I think the game could benefit from more regulation, but more nuanced regulation, and I think that would allow money to be spent in a better way. I mean, like we say with the APT case, one of the issues there, again, we come back to what we were talking about earlier with ownership, which is basically the unique nature of the ownerships at City and Newcastle means some of the APTs we're talking about there are just not applicable to any other business, because you're coming down to the legal structures of UAE and Saudi Arabia, and kind of the distinction between the private sphere and the state sphere in what are kind of autocracies based on a patronage system. But we're getting into kind of far bigger issues there. So I don't necessarily think that loosening or changing any rules on APT necessarily affects that. In fact, it's interesting there, especially as you mentioned, kind of where we're going to go next. And I suppose we have to talk generally here because as we speak, we're in the midst of some of the outcomes of the recent City case, obviously before the hearing next year. So we don't know how that's going to happen. So we don't know what the full outcome is going to be there. But I think what was interesting was that this was another judgment where competition law was used, and there's actually been a series of these going back to, say, the lawyer's case the FIFA, or sorry, the agent's case the FIFA tried to pursue last year, the Super League case in December, and also the Lasana Diarra case. Now, the Diarra case is more about labour law in Europe. But in almost every single one of those, what actually happened, and I think this is not ironic, but maybe it wouldn't have gone the way people expected a few years ago, but virtually every single court, the judgment is about, well, football authorities have to start thinking more about, the sustainability of their sport, but also they have to start thinking about the diversity of the sport and competitive balance. Because I suppose what we've seen in football for 30 years has been almost an open market, and it probably was set off by Bosman and along with other factors coming together, which meant money generally flowed in specific areas. It was a concentration by design. I think that's probably what created the 12 super clubs, if you want to call them, that ultimately tried to create a Super League in 2021. Like the financial gaps between those clubs and some of their rivals, they didn't exist 20 years ago. I think there's a stat that in 1992, the wage gap between the top club in the Premier League and the bottom club in the Premier League was something like 3-1, whereas in these days it's 7-1, which I suppose says a lot about how the landscape is changing that. But just, I think, because of the way these legal judgments are going, and I'm not talking about the City one here specifically, more just this general trend of them, I think there's going to be an onus on football authorities to behave more responsibly as regards finance. But of course, the great irony of this is, as we have these legal rulings, you're talking about clubs trying to kind of create more money. Well, what's actually happening at the moment? You mentioned the expansion of the Champions League. FIFA want to create their own Club World Cup because they basically want to. Gianni Infantino, the president, wants his own version of the Champions League, his own the riches of the club game, essentially. So you have the kind of regulators, even though at the same time as the kind of courts are telling them to behave more like regulators, the regulators, particularly in FIFA and UEFA, are behaving like competition organisers. And of course, that's what the Super League case comes back down to a lot, because the clubs want to control the competitions themselves. And of course, that's going to create potentially huge income opportunities if FIFA can guarantee the funding they want, or that the clubs want, in negotiations of this Club World Cup. Well, the money could be enormous there, and like people are talking about it, that could be, as potentially disruptive as the Super League if the Club World Cup, say, takes off. And at the moment, say the plans are for it to happen every 4 years, but if it's successful in the USA, you can, especially given every single club is trying to expand their markets into the USA to exactly what you're talking about, to create more financial headroom, then you can easily see a situation where the Club World Cup expands. Maybe you can have more clubs from each country so they can bring in the kind of biggest clubs. Like, I think from what I've heard, FIFA say are a little bit concerned, or figures within FIFA are concerned, that Liverpool, Manchester United and Arsenal aren't in it this year because they are the most popular club or popular English clubs around the world. But we could be in a situation where it expands, it's happening every 2 years, and then it's kind of because the talk is something like prize money for clubs of $80 million. If that's coming in every 2 years, again, I suppose you're changing the financial landscape a bit more.
The other thing, very quickly to end, that could change the landscape is an independent regulator in football. Threatened here in the United Kingdom. Labour have brought back the bill, so it could well happen. We don't know what shape or form. Richard Masters of the Premier League kind of argues that could destroy the product of the Premier League. Why would we hold ourselves back? The controls that we've had so far, we've managed to build ourselves as the best league in the world. Would that be a really bad thing, or could it really be a good thing for English football?
I think without seeing the full detail or the width and breadth of what the regulator would do, it's very hard to say the positives and negatives. What I would say is, I think football means so much to local communities, and I think there is a right to protect clubs. And there's also, no one likes to see clubs going out of business or people losing their jobs. And I think there is a responsibility that clubs are run in a way that protects everyone. But grassroots community is at the heart of football. That's where you start your football journey. So I think if the regulator's coming in to protect those two areas of the game and investment in those areas, then fine. But when that starts growing and the influence starts growing, that's again where we're going to run into bigger arguments.
So, as you can tell, the solutions-based future for football is a difficult one for us to wade through in an hour. So many different opinions on it and so many different intricacies on how things might change moving forward. Certainly, we're going to be keeping a close eye on it. And actually, before you go, Miguel, just wanted to ask you, are people keeping a closer eye on stories like this? How has it changed for you as a journalist covering stories of these types?
I mean, I funny enough, I was talking about this with someone the other day. Obviously, a lot of us got into this job because we love football and whatever we, you loved English or reporting or whatever. So like almost two things came together. But what we find now is, I think covering games and kind of the on-pitch stuff, that must be about, at this stage, only about 20% of the job. Now, part of it is because what happens on the pitch is obviously shaped and influenced by what happens off it. But like I've found in the last few years covering, say, like 2022 World Cup, some of the, the issues around FIFA, UEFA, so many legal cases. You've almost got to have a background in accounting, in law, have a knowledge of a certain level of geopolitics, particularly in the Gulf or around Latin America. So like we there's some range of issues that come up now. And I suppose a part of that as well is, and I mean, I remember someone saying to me that, 20 years ago, fans started to become obsessed, say, and journalists too, where they were finishing on the Deloitte rich list as much as they were on the table. And that's almost that's obviously evolved in the past 20 years, where it's not just that fans have, and you can see it in discussion on social media, fans aren't just discussing issues like amortization and things like that. Well, now we're discussing issues like APT and all manner of acronyms and kind of very specific legal and financial details that certainly in as late as the 1990s would have felt a world away from grass and a ball and white lines.
Yeah, very, very interesting. You see fans celebrating the outcome of a legal case as much as getting 3 points on the weekend. Football is certainly changing. Miguel, been so interesting to have you with us. We got to get you back on a future episode to discuss sports washing. I think it's a huge, huge topic in football. The book is called States of Play, How Sports Washing Took Over Football. So make sure you check that out. Get it on your Christmas list as well. Listen, thank you, Marlon. Thank you, Miguel, for being with me. Thank you all for listening as well. Make sure you check out Decision Makers. Make sure you subscribe. You can also check us out on social media. You'll find all of our handles in the description for this episode. If you really liked it, please do leave us a review as well. And if you missed episode 1 with Fulham defender Calvin Bassey, we had a lot of fun. Make sure you check that out as well. We'll be back very, very soon with Decision Makers. Take care.